So, hello and welcome to this episode of Physical Attraction. Now, way back in September 2017, approximately 150 episodes ago or so, I had my first ever guest on the show. It was Phil Torres, and interviewing him was such a great experience that it actually sort of inspired me to have several other guests on the show since. And we've sporadically stayed in touch, I think, over the last 3 years since he's been on the show. And it seems highly appropriate then that he would be our first ever repeat guest. And it may not have escaped anyone's notice that we're in a bit of a catastrophic risk crisis at the moment, and Phil has devoted a huge chunk of his career to studying existential risks. It's the kind of career where I think you never really want to be all that relevant, but unfortunately that's where we are at the moment. So we'll start by talking about the coronavirus specifically, and we'll move on to Phil's recent work more broadly later on. So, Phil, first of all, thanks very much for coming on the show. How are you doing in the midst of this crisis personally?
Thanks a lot for having me. It's really wonderful to be back. I am doing okay, although, as you mentioned, this is not this. These are not the topics that I've focused on in the past. Um, these are not things that I want to, to actually happen in the world. There's a funny aspect to the field of global catastrophic risk studies, namely that its ultimate goal is to eliminate any reason for there to be a whole bunch of scholars who are focused on these issues. So it's very weird having talked about and thought about these global pandemics and so on in the abstract for so long and sort of pondered as clearly as possible the implications and consequences and so on of a global pandemic actually happening, and then to kind of be in the midst of this actual situation. It feels very weird and unsettling um, for me, as it does for many people around the world. But ultimately, I'm hanging in there, and yeah, doing okay.
That's good to hear. Okay. Let's start by talking about the coronavirus then, with the standard disclaimer at the start that neither of us are virologists or epidemiologists. I think we would describe ourselves probably as just people who like to listen to and read the words of experts. And of course, also that the situation with this pandemic is evolving very rapidly. And so the things that anyone says now could well be disproved in the course of a few weeks. But one thing that really strikes me just about this crisis in general, regardless of how it turns out from now, over and over again, is just how foreseeable it was. A novel coronavirus transferring from animals to humans is something that happens pretty reliably every decade or so. We saw it with SARS, we saw it with MERS. We know that there have been other viruses that are zoonotic in origin that come from animals and move onto people. In terms of the pandemic itself, the situation bears a lot of similarity to flu pandemics, which occur quite often. We think of swine flu in 2009, and of course, everyone is now learning a lot more about the Spanish flu in 1918-19, which was perhaps the last pandemic comparable to what we might expect from this one. If you were drawing up a list of likely catastrophes to strike in the future, it would be pretty near the top. And it's not just us saying this. There was a modelling exercise, Event 201, from the Centre for Health Security, which Bill Gates has been involved with. Now, in October 2019, the very scenario that they picked for causing the next pandemic, which is something that Gates himself has been warning about for a long time, was a new coronavirus that transmitted across to humans. And just a month or so later, the first cases of that actually happened in reality. So, given how predictable this was, how is it that the world seems to have been caught so flat-footed by it, and do you think that they have been?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like there are regions of the world that weren't caught so flat-footed. I've read some statements by officials in South Korea who did acknowledge that they were quite surprised by the rapidity of propagation among the population. I think they had their first 30 cases, and nothing seemed to be particularly out of the ordinary. And then patient 31, so-called patient 31, was a super spreader, and the cases went up from 31 to 2,000 in a very short amount of time. But nonetheless, and I think maybe we'll talk about this a bit later as well. But yeah, they've done a pretty good job. But you know, I'm here in the U.S. and am profoundly disappointed in the dangerously incompetent response from the Trump administration. And I think part of the flat-footedness can be perhaps traced to the zeitgeist of anti-intellectualism that imbues um, American culture, has for the past few decades. You saw this with the George Bush administration, and then the rise of politicians like Sarah Palin, and so on, where part of the anti-intellectualism is that, it's tied into the rise of populism, which has resulted in a disparaging of expertise, of scientific knowledge, and consequently you have individuals, informed individuals, epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, and so on, as you mentioned, who have been warning about this possibility for quite a while, and it's fallen on deaf ears because people distrust individuals who have spent years and years in universities, actually researching these issues. And of course, Bill Gates, who you had also mentioned, he now famously warned about the possibility of a pandemic in a TED talk from a few years ago. So yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with a sort of pervasive distrust of science and expertise, and I think that has been an engine of that kind of that sort of epistemic attitude has been right-wing media and right-wing politicians, again, from sort of the George Bush administration all the way up through Trump. And it's finally it's no longer just annoying for people who care about truth, but it's actually costing human lives and devastating the global economy and so on.
I think I would definitely agree with you that one of the aspects has been the disdain for expertise. The other thing that I think, and I'm sure you'll probably agree with me on this, is the way that we consume our information has changed quite radically, even in just the last 20 or 30 years, where now a lot of people are getting information from Facebook, from Twitter, from the plethora of news websites that are available on the internet, many of which are not subject to the same kind of editorial guidelines that might have been present in the past. Although, of course, there's always been scandal rags and newspapers that tell lies and so on.
Mm-hmm.
There is this strange world of Twitter, and I know we're both Twitter users. I use it quite a lot, but even in that context, the epidemiologist and the random person with an opinion are presented to you on the same platform as almost equivalent voices, and absent or not a blue check mark telling you that someone is supposedly in some way more important than someone else, although perhaps not an epidemiologist or a professor, but maybe just someone famous from the media or whatever. There is no immediate way to distinguish who's right and who's wrong, and it can sort of seem that we're in this situation, and I think it's part of this culture of anti-intellectualism that you mentioned, where my opinion is as good as your expertise is the standard that people are going to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's completely right. There is definitely a deep, arguable, profound problem with the elevation of non-expert voices to the same level as voices who are expressing, expert insight about various issues. There was a really good talk given by the actor and comedian Sacha Baron Cohen, and this must have been, I can't remember, 6 months ago or maybe longer, where he was it was surprisingly engaging and cogent discussion of the problems with like Facebook in particular, as well as Twitter and Instagram and so on. And there was a point which he referred to Facebook as the biggest propaganda machine, the greatest propaganda machine that has ever existed in human history. And that seems right. I think Twitter just recently, maybe you could be more precise, um, announced that they're going to start to censor misinformation about COVID-19, conspiracy theories, and claims about um, cures, potential cures. I know Alex Jones has gotten in trouble for advertising, toothpaste that's going to kill the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So I think Twitter is taking some actions. I'm not so sure if Facebook is, but it is without a doubt. I mean, this is it is a catalyst for that enables the denigration of expertise that is just unlike anything in a qualitative sense, unlike anything that's ever existed before. And it's it's very worrisome. I don't know how exactly to combat that except to demand that these companies are much more responsible in terms of filtering out false information than they have been.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to have taken the position to me on a lot of these individual cases of saying, "Oh, we're a platform, not a publisher, and therefore we have no responsibility um,
Hmm.
to filter out these things." And from one perspective, you can sort of see that. From another perspective, though, a big part of me wants to say, "Yes, but you profit from this.
Yeah,
You are profiting from keeping people on your website looking at inaccurate information, and you have a social responsibility, if not like a fiduciary one, to
yeah,
actually do something about it."
yeah,
Because you have the power to influence people. And Facebook and Google and Twitter, they have departments, research departments in their own companies that will look into, oh, this is how we can swing an election this way, and this is how we can influence people this way, and so forth. And I think some of the things that they have done have been good in terms of putting prominent notices about where official sources of information can be accessed.
hmm,
That kind of thing is good. It's also quite low effort compared to the massive maintenance and removal of false information that you need to do to actually make these places more reliable platforms in general.
yeah,
So it's definitely an issue
yeah.
that we're coming into at the moment.
If
And I
if I
think
may add, if you don't mind, just I feel like there's the deeper issue is sort of epistemological. Um, it's there are a lot of people out there. It's one thing for there to be a flood of misinformation, out there on the marketplace of ideas, um, contaminating the marketplace of ideas. But it's another thing if individuals lack a kind of information literacy and aren't and don't have the epistemological tools to identify good information from bad information. And, at least in the U.S., the de-emphasis on the importance of education, I think is it's the effects of that are sort of coming to fruition. Um, indeed, I had written shortly after the election of Donald Trump on November 8th, 2016, that one of the worst effects of his presidency, I think, is the normalization of bad epistemology. This notion that, to use your phrase, my opinion is good as your expertise. Um, that you don't need evidence. You don't need to consider the totality of evidence when evaluating the epistemic status of some proposition. Uh, and so I think there's just kind of like some really deep philosophical problems that are kind of ubiquitous in society, and these have really uh, have a lot to do with why people don't really care about haven't really cared about what the epidemiologists have been warning for the longest time, and many still really don't. They still uh, are willing to ignore or argue against the advice of experts. So it's a bad situation.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
I think I mean it's interesting in some ways. I feel that I have been pleasantly surprised by the way that a lot of people have been willing to go along with this, the sort of strong social distancing measures that have been imposed. And I don't think that necessarily it was clear in the earlier stages of this pandemic that something like what was achieved in China could be done here due to the difference in the government and the governing structure and the ability of them to enforce their will. It does seem like there has been a lot of adherence to social distancing at the moment. I don't know whether it's going to last for long enough to prevent new flare-ups of the epidemic, but
Hmm.
I think that's been a pleasant surprise so far. And when you talk about education as such an issue, I mean, obviously I would go on about this as a physics student. Mathematical and scientific education is so important, and this kind of situation illustrates it, because I know that in the earlier days of this, you'd see a lot of people saying, oh, a few thousand people have died of coronavirus compared to how many thousands per year that die of the flu. And
Mm-hmm.
you just think that you should be able, as an adult functioning in society, to see the logical fallacy there in terms of comparing something that, has already affected millions of people to something that is currently only affecting 10,000 people, and
Mm-hmm.
realizing that the fatality rate rather than the number of fatalities is the important thing, and an appreciation of the fact that an epidemic would initially at least grow exponentially by percentages rather than linearly by numbers of cases, meaning that you really can't make statements like that about the early stage of an epidemic and assume that they will always hold true. I think that kind of the level of scientific and mathematical knowledge
Mm-hmm.
um, could have helped not just people comply with the orders earlier on, but also helped those people put more pressure on the government to institute those orders. Because in Britain, I don't want to go too much into UK politics here, but there
Mm-hmm.
was a perception that the lockdown should be delayed by a week or two, basically, because they felt that the British public wouldn't comply with it. And I think if there was evidence that people were more willing to comply with this and that they were calling for it earlier on, that could have made a difference. And I think that could have come if we'd had a little bit better scientific and mathematical awareness. And also, it's not just education too. I think we have to think about the cognitive biases that make this kind of thing difficult to prepare for. And so there's this normalcy bias where people are, I was thinking about the perspective of this from someone who's quite a bit older than me, and they might be thinking, well, I remember when they gave us these dire warnings about disease X, disease Y, swine flu could have been one of them,
Mm-hmm.
Zika, Ebola, SARS, MERS, people might remember. Um, the sort of what that can do to people, I suppose, is make them desensitized over time to these kind of claims, and it can make risk harder to assess for people. And I think you'd call that the survivorship bias, I guess, in terms of cognitive biases that impact people.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that shows up, I know a lot in existential risk studies, is not just survivorship bias, but also if you do something that prevents something bad from happening, then the effect of your prevention is never fully appreciated, if you see what I mean.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's
Absolutely.
sorry, yeah.
Mhm.
So just if you'd want to talk a little bit about some of the cognitive biases that we expect to show up in situations like this, and that have shown up so far.
Yeah. I do think it's really important to note that individuals who prevent something from happening, particularly something that would have been catastrophic, so catastrophic that many individuals would have found it just the outcome unfathomable. Um, that these individuals tend not to get the credit that they deserve. Obvious examples would be like Stanislav Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov, who were two individuals who essentially single-handedly prevented all-out thermonuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. Archipov's situation that happened, I think, maybe 2 days or so before the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, which a lot of people have considered to be one of the most dangerous moments in human history. Um, if we rewind history maybe two or three times, the outcome would very likely have been a nuclear conflagration of some sort. So, anyways, I don't mean to ramble too much about that, but most people haven't heard of Stanislav Petrov, and that's because he prevented. The outcome was a non-happening rather than a happening, and a happening tends to be a bit more conspicuous than a non-happening. So, um, yeah, it's other cognitive biases. I think that come to mind immediately are like scope neglect, which is scope neglect and what's called psychic numbing, which are very closely related and more or less refer to our inability to respond in a emotionally proportionate manner to disasters that have um, really enormous effects. And then, of course, there's also the availability bias, whereby if examples of some type, some class of event are easy to recall, then one tends to judge future instances of this type to be more probable than others. So and perhaps this ties into what you were saying before, that there have been dire warnings in the past having to do with MERS and SARS, Zika, and so on, that ultimately did not result in a 1918 Spanish flu type catastrophe. And so based on those past experiences, older individuals might be more inclined to uh, to uh, manifest a kind of dismissive attitude towards the COVID-19 outbreak. Um, so I think central to the study of existential risk has been a close examination of cognitive biases and heuristics to try to defend against these intellectually distorting kind of influences. Only once you get rid of those can you sort of see things clearly and guard not just against a tendency to minimize the risk posed by certain kinds of phenomena, but also when you study it, when your livelihood depends on there being these threats in the future, to guard against overinflating their probability and their significance moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how there are even some examples of how this has happened specifically. I was reading a story in the news about France, and apparently the health minister of France, when the swine flu outbreak first started, became very concerned and stockpiled a lot of PPE and a lot of equipment and a lot of medicine that could help in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, the very thing that we're saying, why didn't all our governments do this before this epidemic, in the early stages when it was easier to accomplish than it is now? And in reality, swine flu was one of those illnesses where, although it did end up killing tens of thousands of people around the world, the fatality rate transpired to be a lot lower than people had initially thought. And this is one of the issues that comes up with lots of epidemics, because the first lens you get on what's happening is people in the hospital with confirmed cases, and those people are obviously biased sample because they're in a bad way already. So in that case, she was actually very strongly criticised. There was an inquiry after the fact as to why she'd taken these measures, and because, of course, it transpired that a lot of that PPE never got used. And I think the interesting thing there is it's like you say, we don't know with hindsight whether her response was proportionate, because if she spent a few million euros on PPE, it might seem like a few million wasted euros. If there was a 10, 20, 30, 50% chance given information that the swine flu epidemic would have turned out like the coronavirus epidemic is turning out now, it obviously would have been one of the best investments that could have been made by the French government at that moment in time. So I think it really was a case that, for me, and I don't know whether that had any impact on France's preparation this time for the virus, but it was one of those instances that drove home to me, okay, this is something that happens in real life. It's not just something that we theorize about. There are people who are being punished, in a sense, for being prepared for things that may happen, and perhaps, I don't know, a lack of understanding about uncertainty is helping us have all of these cognitive biases, because it's always this question of how much is it worth spending, how much resources do you allocate to something that has a 1 in 100 chance of a truly catastrophic outcome. And I think that's an issue that the field of existential risks has spent a lot of time trying to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's absolutely true. And yeah, there's a weird sense in which, if you want to be lionized as a hero, maybe, assuming you're, a particularly effective scholar who comes up with, useful ideas that are actionable, that can be converted into effective public policy, then existential risk really isn't your field, because it's about the preemptive avoidance of outcomes, rather than just responding to some event that has has global scope, and that begins to unfold. So yeah, and I think a lot of people who don't have the right training do struggle with these counterfactual cases, trying to grasp why exactly it was completely judicious for an individual or a government to use up finite resources in an effort to be prepared for an event that may be improbable, but if it were to occur, the consequences would be huge. And of course, the standard definition of risk is the so-called expected value definition, which is that risk equals the probability of an undesirable event multiplied by its consequences. So even if you have a very low probability low probability event that's undesirable, if the consequences are really huge, then the risk as a result is evaluated as being huge as well.
And it seems like when it comes to that particular equation, people could have assumed as soon as this novel coronavirus showed up in China that actually now, at that stage, the risk of something quite catastrophic happening should have been high, even if their assessment was only that, oh, there's only a 10% or a 20% chance that this ever makes it out of Wuhan or Hubei province or out of China and causes a global pandemic. You feel like that's still going to give you, when you multiply that by the expected damages of a global pandemic, a pretty significant indicator of risk and preparation that was necessary.
Yeah.
And it just makes you wonder I'm sure after this there's going to be a lot of inquiries into what has happened in various different countries and investigations into the minutes of meetings and so on that we'll all be poring over. But it does make you wonder whether people were thinking about risk in that sense and what they thought was worth allocating to this, or whether, because I think a big part of this that we deal with a lot in this field and similar fields is how people assess probabilities. People don't necessarily have a sliding scale in their mind. It's a little bit like ratings for movies, where some people will give a movie 4 stars or 5 stars. Some people will give it 78%, and you think, well, delineate for me the difference between a 78 or a 79% movie. I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And in our assessment of probabilities, we're quite similar. Things are either, could never happen, or quite unlikely, probably not going to bother with that, or quite likely, or certain. We don't have the sliding scale in our heads automatically and heuristically to try and assess these sort of things.
Yeah. One thing that actually worries me. So this is I'm responding in particular to your statement that after the fact there's going to be all sorts of studies and government reports on what could have been done better. Which what sort of failures led to more deaths than were necessary. And I'm concerned that the focus is going to end up being on pandemics, when the fact of the matter is that there is a growing array, a constellation of different kinds of threats facing humanity. For the longest time, because I'd been writing about this and talking to epidemiologists, we knew that another global pandemic was going to happen. On the one hand, we're in a little bit better shape than, for example, from 1918 to 1920, when the so-called Spanish flu outbreak occurred. And I believe at the time, scientists had not even identified the flu virus. Readers can double check, but I'm quite sure that that's the case. So we're in a much better situation these days in terms of our scientific understanding of pathogenesis and related phenomena. But at the same time, of course, we have international travel and globally interconnected economic system, which make us perhaps more vulnerable. So, epidemiologists have been sounding the warning in a clarion manner for quite a while. And I could go back to things that I wrote. Just I'm not saying this was an original point of mine. To the contrary, I'm drawing from their expertise, saying that it's kind of a matter of when rather than if it happens again. And my point is that we're in that same situation with respect to, for example, supervolcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts. And then there are emerging threats, that have to do with engineered pandemics and nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and geoengineering. So some of these, are unprecedented, the emerging threats, but other ones we know, just like a natural pandemic, it's just a matter of time before it happens. I think on average, a supervolcano erupts once every 50,000 years or so. And I can't remember just off the top of my head when the last one that the last eruption was. It
We're
wasn't
due the
the
next one, I think, is the story that people say a lot. And
we're
we could be due it within an error bar of 10,000 years, or we could be due it next year. We don't know necessarily.
Exactly, yeah. And there's been some very worrisome discoveries that the magma chamber under Yellowstone National Park, under the supervolcano there, is about twice as big as what was previously estimated. And there's kind of, if you ask a geologist, they'll say it's a bit inaccurate to say we're due, because there isn't just a timer that's going to. But there isn't nonetheless a sense in which, Yellowstone, it's kind of due a little bit. It could erupt next year. So this is something that we should be thinking about for the exact same reason that we ought to have been taking seriously the possibility of a global pandemic last year, for the last several decades.
Mm-hmm. And so I suppose the question here then is, and of course it's far too early to say this, but do you think that the fact that people have now realised that things can head south, that there's this sense of, I mean, I don't want to single anyone out, but I was talking to someone about the pandemic when I first started to get worried about it, which was sort of mid-February, and it's obviously months and months after proper epidemiologists were going on and on about how this could be a really dangerous threat, which they were talking about from January. I only noticed a few weeks after China shut down its entire economy, which you thought should have been a sign to the rest of the world that maybe things weren't totally peachy with this outbreak of novel pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
I was saying to people, this could come over here, and that the general response was just this normalcy bias that came through of, no, it can't happen here, it can't get that bad here.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's because we have too much faith in our technology or our institutions of government, whether a certain amount of it is frankly Western arrogance that these things don't happen in countries like America or Britain or Europe, and they're relegated to other places. And I wonder whether having this shared traumatic experience, which is what it's going to be for everyone on the planet, really,
Mm-hmm.
is going to cast some doubt on people in the future who say, no, these disasters couldn't happen, because we will have an example to point to, and we'll say, we have an example here of something that was thought to be a tail risk that turned out to happen. So do you think that will be the effect that we'll see for existential risks in general after this? Or do you think, as you say, there's more of a concern that it might just be pandemics that we think about and not other issues as well?
Yeah, I am worried that people will compartmentalize types of risks, and they may become more open to considering the possibility of future pandemics. Although even that, I'm not so sure about. But I worry, and I suspect that the whatever new robust concerns there are for about a future pandemic, I suspect that those won't transfer to other types of risks. It's not going to heighten people's um, uh, sense that, for example, climate change is real. It's here. It's going to have catastrophic, just unprecedentedly disruptive, socially, economically, culturally, and so on, politically, consequences. So that is a big concern. I mean, already, a lot of people have tried to tie climate change to this outbreak. There was an article in, I think it was the Telegraph or something, on Extinction Rebellion, where some internal emails were leaked, and the individuals were talking about essentially using the COVID-19 outbreak as a springboard to galvanize individuals into caring about climate change. But so far, and I myself have argued with various people about if you're going to believe an immunologist, then you should believe a climatologist, because the methodology and the epistemological apparatus that's being used by one is the exact same that's being used by the other. And um, my own sense is that a lot of people persist dogmatically in sort of rejecting the warnings of climatologists about increased carbon dioxide emissions. So and also I just I just retrospecting historically, through history, I just worry that humanity's not good at learning from the lessons of the past. There is a kind of historical collective amnesia, and this fuels my sort of general dis- deep disappointment in the species. you know, Carl Linnaeus, back in whatever it was, 18th century or 17th century, gave us the classificatory binomen Homo sapiens, which I increasingly come to think is a misnomer, because it's the wise man. Um, so I do, I can very easily imagine a world in 10 years from now in which the lessons just haven't been learned and the memory has faded. We're right back to where we were before, and then in addition, the lessons that of this global catastrophe that is ongoing right now, that these the lessons that should have been then transferred to other risk domains like climate change and nanotechnology and so on, that those will be non-existent as well. So we'll not be in a better situation. I know that's a bit pessimistic and a bit cynical, but those are my thoughts.
Well, that's why we have you on to tell us what you're thinking, rather than saying something else. I mean, I think that when you talk about looking historically as well, here's me trying to make this hopeful case that people will look at a pandemic and say, "Oh, look, this means that tail risks are more likely to happen than we thought, and things that we never thought could be possible can
Mhm,
occur."
mhm,
I mean, one example that a lot of people are comparing this to, especially given the situation in New York at the moment, is 9/11. The September 11th terrorist attacks, I don't feel like the message that people necessarily got from that was these tail risks and this disruption to our way of life are more likely than we considered. It was more something that was quite narrowly focused on the importance of combating terrorism. And whatever you think or don't think about the efforts and the things that have been done to do that and in the name of that over the last 10, 20 years, it's certainly not the case that it seems to have made us that much more prepared for other types of disaster.
I think that's right. I think there's a more general moral to that very unfortunate situation, which is that these tail risks do happen, and they can have really massive repercussions for world history. But yeah, instead there was just a focus on terrorism in particular, and I'm not even sure those lessons were really effectively learned. Prior to those attacks, there was so 1993, I think it was when there was the World Trade Center bombing, and that was not perpetrated by Al Qaeda, but by some individuals who ended up being affiliated with Al Qaeda. And there were individuals during that decade who were warning quite a lot about the possibility of a really catastrophic terrorist attack, and they were overwhelmingly ignored. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and 3,000 Americans lost their lives, and kind of overnight, the situation in academia was there was no field, no discipline that was focused really on terrorism, because the overwhelming consensus was that state actors, and the dynamics of between state actors is really, that's the locus of potential
Your
conflict
kind
in
of
the future.
post-Cold War politics, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of changed overnight. And I feel like there's basically there were a lot of people saying like, this just can't happen. I can't imagine something, just a group of individuals. Al Qaeda at its peak, around 2001, was like maybe 500 to 1,000 individuals. Really small group. I can't imagine that these individuals would would precipitate some kind of really huge change in um, in world politics, world affairs, and so on. So, anyways, it's kind of a parallel situation a bit with the COVID-19. I think maybe studying the effects of 9/11 on government policy, on academic scholarship, and so on, though that could provide some insights for anticipating how those entities are going to respond to this COVID-19 outbreak, and whether or not there's really going to be more permanent positive changes as a result of this, of this improbable but high impact event.
One of the things that has been interesting so far about this pandemic has been how different countries and different authorities have responded, which we've talked a little bit about already. To a certain extent, it seems like most countries now have tried to enforce some kind of lockdown, social distancing, people staying at home and avoiding each other. That's been the main measure. There's good evidence and good basic science behind the idea that this will, at least initially, is going to help to control the spread of the virus. But obviously, it's had huge, unprecedented side effects that are very damaging for society and likely to be politically unpopular. And there has been a temptation to try and strike a balance between restrictions on movement and the projected death toll from the virus. And I think this is interesting as well, because when it comes to trying to assess risks in the abstract, which is something that existential risk studies does an awful lot, we do think about these questions of, okay, is the economic impact of doing measure X versus the lives saved by doing measure Y worthwhile? And we try to sort of understand how these questions work. But what do you make of the different ways that governments around the world are tackling this problem, and the perhaps false dichotomy that's coming out now that it's a question between the economy versus saving lives?
Yeah, as I sort of gestured at earlier, there are some countries, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, that have done what appears to be a fairly good job at containing the outbreak. And I think what made the difference, my understanding based on reading commentary by epidemiologists, is testing. That made all the difference. When you have information about who is infected, then you can figure out who they've been in contact with, isolate and quarantine as appropriate. And then that contrasts quite strongly, of course, with the U.S. response, which has just been a blundering debacle. It's hard to imagine how the Trump administration could have done a worse job. I think.
Well, to interject here, I think probably the moment where I really started slapping my head about the US response was at some point quite early in the pandemic, when there was a ship moored off California that had a few cases on. And there were a few cases on the mainland confirmed at that time in the US as well. And Trump said that he didn't want the ship to land in the US because that would, quote unquote, double the numbers overnight from one ship that wasn't even our fault. And that was the moment where I thought, my God, this is the same person who is going to say, don't test because it makes us look bad. And that's the exact opposite of the transparency and the approach that is going to be necessary in the situation. And seeing the sort of level of high-level kind of minimizing of this stuff. Of course, it's very difficult to know what impact a political leader has on the actual functioning of government to that extent. And I think the Trump presidency has actually been a very interesting experiment in how much influence they do have. But as you say, when that is your situation, and I know there was a very specific problem with the CDC tests and the way that was rolled out as well, you can see that this is where the exponential really comes into it. If you have a chance to get on this thing early and start testing and contact tracing and isolating, you have an opportunity not to have to shut down your entire country to try and stop it from getting completely out of hand. So the measures that we're seeing are sort of a failure of a Route A strategy that would have worked much better if implemented much more robustly and much earlier. And that's why it seems like such a foresight failure at the moment. Sorry to just interject, but that was my perspective on the US anyway.
Yeah, no, that's really useful to say. I think you're totally right that you don't need society-wide categorical lockdown when you have the data necessary to identify who's sick, figure out who they've coughed on, and and then quarantine those individuals. The word you just used is a key word: foresight. I feel like if there are two words that that are inapplicable to the Trump administration. It's foresight and wisdom, and I feel like a combination of um, those intellectual and moral attributes really could have obviated the situation that we're in now, which is which is really quite bad. Um, so and at this point, I think it's mainly just a waiting game, and I think the game ends when there's a vaccine. It could be the case that there is a really efficacious treatment that emerges as well. So even if you get sick, you're able to take your, Dayquil, sinus, cold, flu, and COVID. Um, and then you sort of, you can carry on. But otherwise, I mean, to get herd immunity, we either need to expose a lot of people to the virus, and as a result, just allow a whole bunch of people to die, or you get a vaccine. And I do worry here in the States about the anti-vaxxer movement and the potential opposition that uh, a mandate to become vaccinated might the pushback that might receive from perhaps a non-trivial demographic of individuals. But yeah, this is um, a waiting game for maybe 18 months, and I think we'll probably just go through these oscillations of an outbreak, and then sort of social distancing measures, kind of stringent social distancing measures being implemented, and then the virus sort of disappearing, and then another outbreak. um, so yeah, but a lot of this really could have been avoided. There are plausible counterfactual uh, scenarios in which we if first of all, if China had had been more responsible and more transparent, then this might not have been nearly as big a deal. But also, Western governments have just really dropped the ball, and performed very poorly.
Hmm. I mean, I think the interesting thing that strikes me about China specifically in this case is the fact that it's a very insular country, and to a certain extent, I wonder whether that has influenced any ability for the kind of the grand mechanisms of global governance to kick in here. I mean, there's been criticism of the World Health Organization, there's been criticism of the UN, there's been criticism of all sorts of people who we thought were going to, step in and try and stop something like this from becoming a global issue. Um, it reminded me, after the atomic bomb was first developed, there was a big movement among scientists saying, okay, we now have to have one world or none. Either we need to stop all of these national divides and these things that are preventing people from cooperating, and have some sort of global system for responding to outbreaks like this. Because, this time it was China. The Spanish flu, as you said, the so-called Spanish flu, there's evidence that started in Kansas. Next year, it could be an illness that comes from Britain. It could be an illness that comes from anywhere that can cause a pandemic. Now, of course, there are arguments about specific hygiene standards in wet markets and so on that you can get into. I suppose the point that I'm trying to make more broadly here is, do you think that it's going to be necessary to have some kind of global governance with much stronger enforcement and a much bigger budget and capability to roam around and squash out, whether it's outbreaks of a new virus, or even concerning organizations that could deploy bioterrorism or nuclear weapons or anything like that around the world, that has that kind of ability to project not just force but scientific and medical expertise and might to different situations around the world to actually prevent this from happening, at a level that far exceeds the sort of loosely bound federations of states that are the current kind of global governance that we have at the moment.
Yeah, there was a really good article, Yuval Noah Harari, in the Financial Times, and he had talked about there being a couple of critical choices that humanity can is going to have to make, and one was between sort of nationalist, as I remember him saying, nationalist isolation and then a kind of global solidarity. And he presented the argument that uh, you know mitigating the effects of a worldwide pandemic is going to be greatly facilitated by a kind of global governing system of some sort. And that seems right to me. You're totally correct that after World War II, and which inaugurated the atomic age, there were so many individuals who thought that there's a exclusive or here, either we're going to have a world government or we're going to end up in perishing in a nuclear holocaust. Einstein, of course, was a vocal individuals, but also there were many in the field of at the time, the sort of emerging field of international relations theory. There's a international relations theorist at Johns Hopkins University named Daniel Dudney who refers to this as nuclear one worldism, and it was these individuals were sort of they found themselves in a really difficult intellectual position because on the one hand they were neorealists. So they believe that the you're never going to escape the there's certain dynamics between states that um, are evinced in the anarchic realm of international politics. And that the only way to actually extricate oneself from this is to have a world government. But as soon as you have a world government, you risk tyranny because the world government could be taken over by some. Anyways, my point is that a lot of these individuals who believed that we probably were just going to have to risk tyranny in order to avoid nuclear annihilation, um, didn't really anticipate the particular configuration of mutually assured destruction, which you know resulted in this kind of quasi-stable balance of terror between the two greatest world powers. But and the reason I mention this is that it's not the case. It's not the same situation with a pandemic where you can ensure safety with some kind of balance of terror. Everybody is, the germ travels at the speed of a jetliner. It doesn't care about, the boundaries of sovereign states. So I do think it's really important for there to be a global governing system of some sort that is able to responsibly coordinate the actions of individual states. And I think this is especially important moving forward, given the possibility of bioterrorism. I feel like the COVID-19 outbreak has been sort of proof of concept that there could be some malicious omnicidal agent who sets up a biohacker laboratory in his or her basement for $500-$600, and then synthesizes gets data, publicly available data about the genomes of various pathogens, and then modifies them and so on. And the COVID-19 outbreak began probably with one individual. So there's been talk in the past about bioterrorism. The one of the major hurdles being the aerosolization of the pathogen. But I mean, with COVID, it was just a single individual who may very well have gotten the virus and then passed it to one or two individuals who passed it to one or two more individuals and so on. So in order to prevent a disaster associated with an engineered pandemic, it's not enough that 90% of states are very responsible in terms of monitoring activities that could be potentially very dangerous. You need 100%, and perhaps the only way to get 100% is by having some kind of governmental apparatus that has relevant control over every region of the world. So I don't know. There are a lot of people in the field who worry a lot about this the potential necessity of um, invasive surveillance, because that seems very undesirable. But at the same time, given the fact that a lot of these emerging technologies like nanotechnology and biotechnology, synthetic biology, and so on, these are not only becoming empowering individuals more than ever before, but they're also becoming more and more accessible to small groups and individuals. So they're multiplying the number of you know potential bad non-state actors out there who could perpetrate some kind of global scale catastrophe. So it's an increasingly worrisome situation.
Hmm. And then, as you say, with these technological risks, there's no balance of power and there's a multiplicity of actors. And you can't
Mhm.
really see a way out of that that doesn't require additional powers and additional surveillance capability on behalf of some authority that is going to try and prevent, because if it's a case of we're no longer trying to prevent a rogue state such as North Korea or Iran
Mhm.
from getting a nuclear weapon. We are now trying to prevent rogue organizations of groups of 50 or 20 or 10 scientists from developing laboratories that can do this kind of incredibly dangerous work. It does make you think. There's a political concept that is sort of on the libertarian right of politics, which is minarchism, which is this idea of what's the minimally acceptable government to have, um,
Mhm.
and that's the sort of thing that they're seeking. And it does make you wonder whether there's some way of thinking about a structure of a government that would be a minimally acceptable global government purely for the purposes of surveilling and preventing against existential risks, and what that government would need to be able to do, and how you could try and hold it in check with the same operation of your nation states that you have at the moment. And specifically speaking as well about this question of surveillance and privacy, it's interesting because this is directly relevant to the solution that people are proposing to the coronavirus pandemic at the moment, which, as you say, is once we've got through this initial wave, to have a huge program of testing and contact tracing, which might be enabled by smartphone apps or so on. Indeed, the UK government today actually announced that there was going to be such an app that is being tested as sort of an official NHS contact tracing app that people will use. And
Mhm.
there was a lot of, there's been some people being concerned about this over the privacy arrangements. For me, part of the issue with that is that the loss of our privacy in the modern world is a fait accompli. If you have a Google phone that is capable of tracking your location, Google knows your location, and they're currently using it to sell you things rather than to defend you against a deadly pandemic.
Mhm.
So there is a question to which we've already signed away all of these privacies or had them taken from us. And there's Shoshana Zupov's book about the rise of surveillance capitalism is saying that these are actually, she views them almost as a
Yeah.
resource that are being extracted from us without our consent or knowledge. And I think there's
Mhm.
certainly an argument for that. This question of the enhanced surveillance to protect against calamities trade off is something that's already being debated with respect to this particular issue.
Yeah, that's right. The security expert Bruce Schneier, who I think is at Harvard, he had a book that came out a couple years ago, or maybe a year ago, called "Click Here to Kill Everyone." And so he talks about he's focused in particular on like cybersecurity, but he talks about the Internet of things. I think he proposes the term the Internet of everything, because basically we're just surrounded by computers that do other things like refrigerate food. And I'm sure lots of listeners have heard this. It's somewhat hackneyed at this point, but our phones are just tracking devices you can also make calls on and browse the internet. So um, yeah, I do. Um, I worry a lot about uh, surveillance. Um, there's I don't think there are that many dystopian novels from recent decades that don't involve if there is a totalitarian state, it involves surveillance and um uh so yeah the I had mentioned earlier the Yuval Noah Harari article, which is it's pretty good. And one of the things that one of the arguments he makes is that when you have uh, uh, a population, a group of citizens who are poorly educated and are being fed misinformation and so on, then it's it's kind of like cheating a bit to say, for the government then to say, people really can't be trusted. It's true that given these conditions, individuals can't be trusted to make to make sagacious decisions about how to behave, whether to go out and commingle with 10 or more people, and so on. But if you have citizenry that is well educated and understands the facts, then these that may be sufficient for them to take actions um, on their own volition that on a collective level result in really good outcomes. So that's sort of what you saw in South Korea, where individuals, the government was completely transparent. Here's what it means that you might be exposed. Here's why you need to be quarantined. And then individuals, are well educated enough to care about what the experts have to say, and then to take the appropriate measures. And as a result, COVID was not a catastrophe in that country. So basically, his argument, which I find appealing, is that we have these technologies that are enabling us to gather more and more biometric data. You know, data about every aspect of our phenotype, and the question is, do we want to then send this off to the big government, Big Brother, and offload the responsibility of um, of making decisions about what the right thing to do is to the government? Or do we want to live in a society where individuals are well educated, they care about experts, and then they use these technologies to gather all of this biometric data, which they hold privately? It's not shared with the government, but then they can make responsible decisions on their own. And so he's sort of was suggesting that we may come out of this morass, either sort of like leaning towards a more totalitarian condition, or a state where the citizens are more empowered than ever. And we have yet to see how things will turn out, but one clearly sounds better than the other. Although, all of that being said, I'm still not sure that um, this circumvents the need for some kind of surveillance apparatus in order to prevent things like bioterrorism, and nanoterrorism, and things of that nature. And increasingly in the future, as these technologies place more and more destructive destructive power in the hands of smaller and smaller groups, it is ever more important that you do not react to an attack, but you prevent the attack. And the only way to prevent the attack is to have gathered information about who is doing what, where, and that involves some sort of digging around in the personal matters of individuals, monitoring their behaviors. But that is not an outcome that I think anybody in the field wants. So a lot of people are struggling right now to figure out how it is that we obviate, we effectively prevent some lone wolf terrorist, terroristic group from initiating an attack without also violating the privacy rights of every individual on the planet.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I don't think I like the optimistic perspective that it could be possible to do this in a more voluntary, ground-up way. I think it would be great if that works out. And I think that, in general, one thing that on the micro level has bugged me about this pandemic so far has been the lack of trust in the public. And I know there's this whole question of disaster management. I think if you're straight with people early on and you let them know the risks, you will get through it better than you will if you aren't straight with people and then they realise later on that the risk is worse than you told them it was. That's when you actually get the panic response that people are trying to elicit by downplaying that people are trying to avoid by downplaying things early on. So it's this question of having a public that is not just educated but also trusted by those in charge to assess things properly, and where we have some dedication to explaining risks to people and letting them know what they can do to help as part of citizenship. And I suppose it all comes down to things that we've talked about being eroded over time, especially in the West, about in terms of trust in institutions and so on. That is going to make these things harder and harder to coordinate over time. I mean, the one thing that I wanted to ask about as well is the treatment of scientific uncertainty in this particular situation, because something of this does remind me of climate science in the sense that a lot of key uncertainties are not even in our modelling necessarily, but in how humans and society at large react to a given situation. We know in climate change the difference between a 2 degrees Celsius world, which would be bad but survivable, and a 4 to 5 degrees Celsius world, which would be potentially catastrophic in ways we can't even predict. That lies in what humans choose to do over the next century. And similarly here, it doesn't matter what the fatality rate or the transmissibility of the virus is, whereas a huge level of uncertainty in what happens actually does arise in how people respond to what they're asked to do. And I think this is the thing in terms of the human response while we're in the midst of this crisis that is hardest to predict, especially in these scenarios that we've talked about, where the lockdown drags out for months and months intermittently and goes off and on for the next 12 to 18 months. And in the context of this, seeing the scientific uncertainties that are being researched being politicized makes me concerned that we might end up dividing into two camps of people who are essentially pro and anti-lockdown. And the nature of a lockdown is that it does require, as you spoke about with this sort of voluntary surveillance for existential risks, it requires buy-in from a huge fraction of the population to be effective. So, I mean, are you concerned about the politicization of not only the pandemic, but also scientific research surrounding it? And do you think there is anything that we can do to try and reverse that, given that society has already sort of divided into camps of people who are willing to do one thing or the other to contradict the other group?
Yeah, I'm very worried about it. I mean, so my sense in terms of this solution, this gets back to what we were talking about before, where I feel like it's the epistemological orientation of individuals that is ultimately the fundamental problem. There's so many studies showing that when you argue with people over issues that are either true or false, there's some fact to the matter, and we know what the truth value of the relevant claim is. That presenting them with facts, the more partisan they are, the more likely they are to for their view to become ossified and rigidified, and for them to become more stubborn when you present them with facts that undercut their preferred view. So, a better approach in debating issues of fact with people is to ask them, well, why do you believe that? Like, on what basis? And these sort of get at more of the epistemological sort of issues, like what is the method by which you came to believe that? Well, I listened to so and so pundit. Well, why do you think that they're trustworthy? So on, and that seems to be a little bit more fruitful. So ultimately, the idea is that I feel like in order to change, as people get older, crystallized memory increases and fluid memory decreases, so people get sort of stuck in their ways. And the most hopeful society-wide strategy, I think, is just better education, to inculcate into eager young minds the importance of basing their views on the totality of evidence, of considering counterexamples, of understanding cognitive biases like availability bias, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, and so on. And then you can start to have a reasonable conversation about these threats in the world. Otherwise, it's the propaganda coming from, for example, the political right, Fox News and Infowars and Rush Limbaugh and so on. It's really difficult to, if you will, sort of inoculate people against all of these alternative facts. And So I think just, reforming the educational system, it's a long term, that the effects are transgenerational in terms of their temporal unfolding, and that's not useful with shorter term risks like pandemics, or not really even that useful with climate change, which is already devastating. There are already climate refugees all around the world. But yeah, in the meantime, science is completely politicized, um, and I don't really have a good solution. As it happens, just over the past couple months, I have, for the first time in a long time, tried to engage people online. This is like sort of classic, like, famous last words or something. Um, but I've tried to engage people mostly just for ethnographic reasons, and just elicited their views on certain things. Like, why is it that you think the number of individuals who are dying from COVID-19 is being inflated, and what is that based on, and why is it that you think the models that climatologists are using are all flawed, but the models that the epidemiologists are using should be listened to? And most of the interactions have just sort of underlined, and this is anecdotal, of course, but they've underlined for me the kind of hopelessness of the uselessness, the osios, the extent to which debate is osios. It just it doesn't. It's really difficult to change people's minds, um, and get them to see issues from new perspectives, to induce a gestalt switch and see things anew. So I don't know really what the answer is, but I do know that people in um, working in the field of global catastrophic risk and existential risk, one thing that's incredibly um, uh, frustrating is that not only is the task to identify the various risks that are facing humanity this century and perhaps beyond, as well as to devise, by pulling from this huge multiplicity of different disciplines, scientific, philosophical, and so on, to devise effective strategies for mitigating these risks. But also, in many cases, you need a sizable portion of the voting population to agree that these risks really are risks. And that's the third big challenge, is just it's it's not just trying to figure out what the risks are. It's trying to convince individuals who are hypnotized under the spell of some political or religious ideology, that these really are threats that could push civilization over the precipice, or toss humanity into the eternal grave of extinction. So and that sort of sociological or psychological task is just the most exhausting. It's way worse than trying to understand what the risks are and how we neutralize them.
And I think the thing that perhaps saddens me a little about this is that I'm reminded of always in this situation, in my own experience with climate change and talking to people who are deniers of the science of climate change. And indeed, I've found myself with an experience of deja vu engaging with people who seem to think this pandemic is not as bad as it was. For example, there's a famous thing that is a cognitive fallacy and so on that people use against climate change, that was used against evolution and so on, which is the Gish-Gallop type of argument, which is where people
Mm-hmm.
present a whole bunch of arguments that are all specious and false in their own way. And so with climate change, usually we'll have someone saying, well, CO2 doesn't cause warming. And then you show them it does. And they say, well, volcanoes are emitting the CO2, which contradicts what they said previously. And
Mm-hmm.
then, you show them that the volcanoes are not emitting it. And then they say, well, it's not, the warming records are made up. And it's like, well, you've presented me with 4 or 5 different arguments to refute, all of which contradict each other. And I had another engagement with someone recently on the subject of the coronavirus, where at first they said there's no evidence that lockdowns and social distancing work. And then they moved on to, well, I think that most people are already immune and have had this anyway, versus, the fatality rate is probably a lot lower than people expect, or the
Mm-hmm.
economic impacts will be worse than the impacts directly from the pandemic. each of those is debatable on its own. When you're being presented with 5 or 6 different points of view in a row like that, it just brought me back to the climate change issue. And I think the thing that really saddens me about it is, I mean, Catherine Hayhoe is a really good person on this, a climate scientist who I think is from a university in Texas. I could be wrong there. And the point that she makes so often in trying to engage with people is there's no intrinsic reason that your political or the cultural stance on things should change your view on issues of risk that affect us all. If you're a cultural conservative, then you care about your community and you want them to do well, and your community is threatened by this pandemic. If you're economically on the right and you're interested in profit and corporate having an efficient system of
maximizing
running
profits.
the world and maximizing profit for shareholders and
Yeah.
the glory of capitalism to enhance things for the human race. Well, a pandemic is bad for business. There are reasons. The same could equally be said of climate change. If you're a conservative, you wish to conserve the world as it is. That includes what remains of the natural beauty of the world that we haven't already destroyed. There are reasons and arguments for everyone, from sheer human compassion, which I think is present in most people, regardless of their political, religious, whatever beliefs there are that they have, to wish and to want to combat this kind of outbreak that affects everyone, as you say, with no regard for national barriers or political beliefs or so on. And so what saddens me is seeing the politicization of this and the politicization of things that should never be politicized in the first place. The argument between the left and the right should really be a question of, okay, to what extent do we need to have private hospitals taking care of people versus public hospitals taking care of people? It shouldn't be an argument about this is or isn't a threat, this is or isn't a pandemic, and it's the fact that it seems to have got so far, to the extent that the knee-jerk reaction on response from one group of people has been to downplay this, and the response from other people has maybe been to, if anything, say that it's worse than it is the thing that depresses me, because it shouldn't be politicized, and yet it has been, and it's so hard to, as you say, to see how we can reverse that, even if it just comes down. And I think also the process you outline of making people question, okay, what is your basis for believing this? I think that's something we all need to do, rather than just something prescriptive. I mean, I suppose in lots of ways it is the basis of the scientific method, isn't it? Saying, well, why do I think this to be true constantly? And if you can't convince yourself of it at the end of the day, then that guides where your next experiment or your next theoretical push needs to go.
Adventures.
Yeah.
So I know there are some climate activists who are deeply upset at Al Gore for having released An Inconvenient Truth. That got him, I think the same year, got him, as well as the IPCC, the Nobel Peace Prize. And the reason for climate activists being, exhibiting some indignation towards Al Gore for having produced this film is that the argument is that made it a political issue, and suddenly it was a kind of Democrats against Republicans. But interestingly, I mean, if you go further back in in history to the period to early 1980s, which was when the nuclear winter hypothesis was developed by a group of scientists, including Carl Sagan. And in 1983, he published several articles, some are in popular media magazines, summarizing the conclusions of this very technical argument, which basically said that in a all-out nuclear exchange, nobody wins. So mutually assured destruction, MAD, then sort of evolved into self-assured destruction, or SAD, and and he was just viciously attacked by people on the right, by Republicans, by the individuals in the Reagan administration. There were all sorts of personal attacks. There were attempts to, basically the idea was that he was proposing this nuclear winter hypothesis because he's a peacenik, and so he's trying to weaponize science to advance his own political agenda, which is easing the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. So even going back, 40 years, there was still this kind of political right, political left, um, anti-science, pro-science kind of dynamic, which is really weird. I mean, it just reminds me also, I mean, another issue that concerns me a lot is that there are, particularly in the US, well, I should say, globally, the percentage of individuals who are religious is increasing. And at least according to one Pew study from just a couple years ago, the percentage of non-religious individuals is falling from like 16% to 13% from a few years ago to the middle of this century. And as a result, you're going to have more and more people who will view world events through a particular prism of religion. And also when it comes to especially catastrophic events, wars, natural disasters, and so on, which are in the prophetic passages of Holy Scripture, they tend to be identified as harbingers of the end. So you will get, I worry that a lot of people will be interpreting like climate change, even AI, future pandemics as well, um, as a religiously significant event rather than a scientifically understandable phenomenon. And I think that could result in a kind of positive feedback loop that just further exacerbates the general risk predicament that we're in. I've definitely seen it so far with COVID-19, because I do intentionally scroll through the feeds of various religious leaders. I was on Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's Twitter feed the other day, and
it's the place to hang out, isn't it?
I back in the day during like the Iraq War, which I was involved in as an opponent. Um, I became fairly familiar with his beliefs, which are deeply apocalyptic. This is really quite fascinating. On multiple occasions to the UN General Assembly, he referenced the end of days messianic figure in his own version, his own 12er version of Shiism, namely the Mahdi. So that's a really significant kind of thing that he kept mentioning this messianic figure and talking about the end times. But anyway, so yeah, every now and then I'm curious what he's thinking about, and he's really been pushing this idea that COVID-19, or rather the virus that causes COVID-19, is the result of a lab. It came directly out of a lab, and it may very well have been synthesized on purpose, which is really fascinating. You get the same narrative among some right wingers here in the U.S. And but also, scrolling through the some well-known evangelicals in the U.S., there are just a lot of people who are saying, this is it. This is a clear, the earthquakes all around the world. There's locusts in Africa right now, and then there's this plague, and this really is very strong empirical evidence. They don't put it that way, but of a particular eschatological narrative that they have already bought into. On a few occasions, I've like very pleasantly asked some of these individuals, like, are you aware that like the Black Plague might have wiped out like half of Europe? Like that. Yeah, it was much more devastating than COVID, which is not to minimize COVID, of course, but yeah, so this is something that I worry about quite a lot. There being this kind of positive feedback loop where the worse things get, the worse they're going to get, because people misunderstand the true nature of what's going on and don't understand the risks of these hazards.
And it's interesting. So just briefly then, since we have mentioned it, I think we've talked about it a little bit already, but just this question of one of the things that we discussed in the past and that has been a focus of the existential risks community is some existential threat arising due to a bioengineered pandemic. The balance of evidence at the moment is very, very strong that the coronavirus is not such a bioengineered pandemic, and there's increasing evidence that the route for transmission into humans is the familiar one that's happened on numerous previous occasions. I think one of the issues with any crisis, and people talk about this in the context of even JFK getting assassinated, is it makes you a lot less certain about the level of security in your world when you see these events occurring without some grand narrative behind them. I mean, the case here is that SARS 2003, MERS 2011, it just so happens that this time we have a virus that is asymptomatic for a proportion of people, which aids transmission, that is mild in a much higher proportion of people, which also aids transmission, and that wasn't controlled in the same way those other viruses were. Those viruses had some advantages which made contact and trace easier, in that people didn't tend to become infectious until they'd already become symptomatic, and so it was easier to figure out who they were. And they also caused much more severe illness, which meant that the average person wasn't running around and still going to work with a mild case of COVID. They were in hospital with SARS or MERS. And so it just seems that there's a few parameters of this virus that just happen to be different to SARS and MERS that have made it a far more dangerous threat for us. And I think the idea that this could happen by chance is something that people don't necessarily want to accept, which is where conspiracy theories come from. And we've seen conspiracy theories surrounding this virus right from the start. In January, there were conspiracy theories about it. And coronavirus has illustrated, in any case, that if in case there was any doubt at all, the devastating impact that a pandemic can have. So, although we don't think this is a bioengineered pandemic, one can easily imagine a disease that's more deadly, or has a longer incubation period, or affects a certain group of people in a particular way, or any number of other things. And we know from previous experiments that you can reproduce viruses in the lab if you want to, as long as you have their sequenced genome. And one thing that struck me immediately when coronavirus showed up and I started paying attention to it was that the sequenced genome, is available online. You can get it on t-shirts now if you want to. So this information about the genomes of viruses, which I think there should be some kind of protection over, given how dangerous they are, does not seem to have been controlled in any way. So in light of what's happening here, does this make you more afraid of bioengineered pandemics? Or do you think that in a kind of twisted way, maybe, it might make us more cautious and more careful and more focused on preventing research into how things like this could be developed, and really heightening the biosecurity around things like genomic information, now that we've seen what a pandemic can do in reality?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess this points back to the conversation we were having before about the likelihood that society will learn a lesson from this really unfortunate snafu. And I feel I'm a bit pessimistic that that will be the case. So I do worry very much about this. I think I mentioned before, this sort of proof of concept that you could synthesize a pathogen that could maybe be aerosolized just in one location, in a single subway area, and maybe that could actually spread around the entire planet. So it's incredibly worrisome. But I mean, years ago there was a Global Challenges Foundation report. They put out annual reports on various topics, and I just co-authored one with my colleague Simon Beard on governance and existential risk. But there was one several years ago that went through, it was a really broad, comprehensive survey of existential hazards. And in the discussion of natural pandemics, they were explicit that it's entirely possible that you might get cooked up in the laboratory of nature a pathogen that combines the lethality of rabies, the incurability of Ebola, the contagiousness of the common cold, and perhaps the incubation period of HIV. And when you tweak the parameters to get a germ like that, I mean, that could be
that's world-ending.
Really, it's potentially world-ending. And it's interesting because it's sort of thinking about these issues in the abstract, and then having exchanges with epidemiologists in the past. there was a fair amount of skepticism from myself, which is mainly parasitic on the skepticism of other people who know much more than I do, um, about the possibility of a pathogen spreading around the entire world. But I feel like one of the, as you were just mentioning, one of the really unfortunate properties of the SARS-CoV-2 germ is that it does have this, um, that asymptomatic individuals can transfer the germ, and that I think like the serial interval is just a little bit shorter than, so that's the point when you become contagious. It's a little bit shorter than the average incubation period. So there's just a greater chance of it propagating through the population, and so this is just underlined to me, and it's just made more vivid, this claim that it's possible for there to be a long incubation um, germ that really does spread around the entire world and make its way into um, some villages that are secluded up in Siberia, or Villa Las Australis in Antarctica, where there's, I don't know, 150 or something scientists.
And that's the end of the first part of our interview with Phil Torres. Remember, you can find the show, Physical Attraction, at www.physicspodcast.com, where you'll find the links to our Patreon and our PayPal and the contact form, which you can contact us on. You can catch up with Phil's work at xriskology on Twitter and at www.xriskology.com. You can help him out there. He also has a Patreon, which you're obliged to subscribe to if you wish, and you can buy his books. The most recent one, I believe, is Morality, Foresight and Human Flourishing, but there's a new one coming out soon, so it's very much worth keeping your eye on those things. Until next time then, take care.